Ok, vamos a empezar este segundo día del coloquio Ecologías Críticas. Voy a hacer esta pequeña presentación en inglés porque la primera de nuestras invitadas de hoy, Kathrin Thiele, no habla español.
No.
So, the first presentation will be from Kathrin Thiele. Kathrin is Professor of Gender, Culture and Ecologies at the Department of Media and Culture Studies at Utrecht University, where she also directs the Graduate Gender Program and the Netherlands Research School of Gender Studies. Her feminist philosophical research focuses on critical inquiries in humanities and social science research, with specific focus on the complexities of a relational understanding of the world. Together with Billi Kaiser, which will be presenting tomorrow, Thiele founded and coordinates Terra Critica, interdisciplinary network for the critical humanities, an international network engaged in re-examining critique for today's global and entangled conditions. And Kathrin's presentation will be about relational matters, critical ecologies as praxis, and we hear you, Kathrin, when you wish to start. You have to unmute. Okay.
True. Okay. But wonderful. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Okay.
Okay, cool. Then I would like to, first of all, of course, thank the organizers of this colloquium, especially you, Noelia, for inviting me here. It's, of course, a pity that I can only join online, but this is good enough. It's wonderful to be here. We met in Valparaiso last year, and I'm missing Valeria, right? At this moment still, she's not here, but I thought I would see her again because it was on a workshop that we co-organized with Valeria Campos in Valparaiso that Noelia and us in Terra Critica met. I would also, of course, once more like to apologize that unfortunately my Spanish is not at all up to scratch for doing this in Spanish. So I'm very happy that we have the transcriptions. And I hope that questions and discussion we can bridge the barriage, the language barrier.
I'm sorry, Kathrin. Maybe you can set the language you are using as English because we can't see the...
Oh, okay. Then I have to do this. Good that you're saying this. Okay. See, there one has to also do something. Okay. Your spoken language is English now.
Okay.
And then, do you see now translation?
Yes, perfect.
Can you see? Oh, perfect. Wonderful. Okay. I hope it was not yet so difficult to follow for this, what I said. Thanks for letting me speak in English. That's for sure. Very kind of you. I would like to share also my screen now because in that sense, then I can start because I will read in the end somewhat because otherwise I would not stay in time. But I hope this way you can follow it a bit better because, of course, online is always such a thing. Okay. Then let me start. What, if not relationality, characterizes today's planetary condition? I asked in the abstract for my presentation in view of this colloquium on critical ecologies. And how to conceptualize relation and relationality. That means how to think, envision, or give shape to it so that we break through the, in my opinion, quite common and too easily comforting image of relation and relationality as some harmonious coexistence. And especially when it's used in discussions of ecology, this seems to come up, i.e. when we start conscientiously to speak from a more entangled, interdependent, or planetary perspective. In my presentation, I would like to focus on these questions because relationality, or what I call in my longer term research, relational matters, they are my specific entry point into critical ecologies as praxis. But I also put focus on these more conceptual or theoretical, practical questions, because from a critical perspective, I feel also the need to somewhat decenter the question of ecology from merely a question of what we think about, i.e. say the non-human or nature, the environment or sustainability, and to attend more seriously again to how we think ecologically. So starting from an ethical onto epistemological, and I return to this phrasing, relational point of view, the question that I would like to bring here to our table is, what does a critical ecological perspective ask for, so that the ecological isn't only a topical focus, but initiates also a transformed critical potential? And I want to explicate that this means centrally for me that I look for a critical ecological potential that does not turn away from the systemic, human and more than human and very deadly inequalities we are living, as well as pays careful attention to the persistent capture of the earth in the hegemonic structure of what we have learned to call CPC in Terra Critica, which means the interlacing structure of colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. CPC. Accentuating the question of ecology this way, I'm adamant about that any hope for change is inherently connected to thought, or what Virginia Woolf in Other Very Dark Times has phrased as think we must. She issued that in 1938 in her work on 3 Guineas. With this accentuation, and this is the question for me, can we also become habituated in a different praxis of cohabitation? An ecology less human exceptionalist and anthropocentric, and therefore rewriting, at least to a lesser degree, the logic that with the critical thinker Sylvia Wynter, we have learned to recognize as the systemic violence of the, and I quote from her, coloniality of being, power, truth, freedom. In this presentation, I combine work I'm doing as a queer feminist critical theorist, deeply engaged in the question of what it means to think critically today, and how to practice critique continuously with care for consistency and curiosity. And on the other hand, my strong commitment to the practice and praxis of planetary relational matters, which is a commitment to a through and through ecological, entangled, and non-separatist way of thinking and living. So again, what, if not relationality, characterizes today's planetary condition? But what is actually meant and wanted from such a statement? What imaginary, what thought horizon is activated when relationality or relation is set up as that primary condition? And by phrasing this, of course, I phrase it from a tradition that I inherit necessarily, which is the Eurocentric tradition of thinking. And there it is something that where relationality and relation comes more secondary, not primary. Of course, other cosmogonies, African cosmogonies from other places than the West, of course, have a very different starting point, or at least can have a different starting point. As I just mentioned, too often in my eyes, and especially often in context of ecological discussions, the relational is evoked as the so-called good solution, in opposition to what we live and experience as our daily reality, torn apart, non-relational, divided, antagonized, polarized differences. And to be honest, of course, also I use relationality in such an ethical manner, i.e. relationality has the potential also for me to envision a solution. And yet, what I learn in my deep dive into relational matters, to put relation first, requires before anything else that on an even more foundational level, we commit ourselves to undo the still so determining thought practice of categorical splitting, that Western philosophical habit, which is built on presupposed moral high grounds, trying to stay categorically separate, and thereby initiate the biased hierarchies and dualities that determine the ideational field. Instead of starting from the safe position of such good and differently affective or effective relational or ecological thought practice, has to, in my opinion, to endure more messiness, more ambivalence, less transparency and clarity in what is to be placed where, in a thought horizon to be used as a tool of measurement. And that shift does something to thinking itself. And this
Kathrin,
is, yeah?
Kathrin, Sorry, are you sliding? Because we are always seeing the same.
Yes, I have not yet put on a different slide.
Okay.
No worries. Thank you.
Sorry.
And that does something to thinking itself, I want to say, and this is why I speak about it as a different praxis. In some way, I feel like today is the anniversary of the death of Hannah Arendt, and I read an article this morning, and it feels like I sounded quite Arendtian with her emphasis on thinking and acting that come always together. And I found this also an important resonance, but I didn't actually think of her here because the tradition that she goes back to is actually maybe precisely a philosophical tradition that I would like to disrupt. Now, after these more general remarks, let me get directly to relationality, to give it further shape. To do so, let me read to you a quote from Judith Butler's The Force of Nonviolence, in which she explicates to us, and this us again is those of us who are philosophically conditioned Western thinking subjects, in which she explicates to us that by committing to the relational, we should realize that relationality is not by itself a good thing, a sign of connectedness, an ethical norm to be posited over and against destruction. Rather, relationality is a vexed and ambivalent field in which the question of ethical obligation has to be worked out in light of a persistent and constitutive destructive potential. My commitment to relational matters as critical ecological praxis implies indeed that when we speak of relationality as planetary condition, we're engaging with an extremely vexed and ambivalent field. The ethical relation is, as Butler says here, only one response to the relational ambivalences that make up this field. And as we quite commonly notice, it's one that is far too rarely chosen in our multiple living ecologies. And right now, I would even go that far to say that I'm keeping so committed to the question of how to conceptualize relationality, because with all the bombs thrown and drones carrying bombs to Gaza, the Ukraine, and many more places, this world seems to not only not choose the ethical obligation, but as a species, we currently seem to literally pulverize the very idea of a less violent coexistence as praxis. But maybe even more concretely in how I want to make the relational be felt or sensed here, let me shortly introduce to you also Laurent Berland's articulation of our relational condition. In their posthumously published On the Inconvenience of Other People, relationality as existential condition, and therefore somewhat different from a philosophical register of ontology, without saying that I don't see it also as ontological, they expose us to the affective register of what they call the over-closeness of the world and how we live it. Inconvenience is for Berland the most suited concept for expressing a pressure of the proximity of many different kinds of tension. It is, as they continue, about the affective sense of the familiar friction of being in relation, to bear the burden of a naming that you didn't ask for, and yet to also realize that we are not going beyond it, only dealing with it as a form of life you live with. What I find important in these conceptual figurations is that Berland details that being relational means to let the world get under my skin, or better even, the world is always already under my skin. Relationality, thus, is living with, or is it even a living as, mostly non-chosen entanglements. And more, without this burden, we cannot even be. And yet again, I would like to keep the use of being here somewhat separate from being just folded into the register of ontology. Relationality or ecology is therefore first of all not about the good, but it's about living, which is always a living with, which is ambivalent, deeply inconvenienced and inconvenient, so clearly somewhat different from the harmonious coexistence that some seem to hear when someone proposes a relational understanding of the world. And yet, also Berland, of course, also for Berland, of course, the point isn't just to complain about this foundational or fundamental inconvenience. Though I believe, and I want to quickly say this here, I think in that book or in that conceptual figuration of inconvenience, they want to also raise such affective realization in their readers to maybe set free a bit of a healthier venting about this existential overwhelmedness. It might be their hope, this is at least my reading, that a more open realization might possibly lead to less harmful responses. And what we see so commonly right now when there's a return to votes for fascist ideologies and fascist leaders who precisely propagate utterly separationist horizons. But to return, also for Ballant, the relational condition which we cannot escape or rid ourselves or even ever come without, this inconvenience drive, as they also call it, is ultimately not something to complain about. But also for them, it is a possibility for transformation, for a foundational shift in our worlding. And this, I feel, they show as their own critical wager when they write, and I read another quote to you. If there is an inconvenience drive, can consciousness of it become a resource for building solidarity and alliance across ambivalence, rather than appearing mainly as the negative sandpaper of sociality? Is it possible to turn ambivalence from the atmosphere of negativity it currently brings with it into a genuinely conflicted experience that allows us to face up to the phenomenality of self-disturbance in the space of coexistence, and even the desire to let in certain objects or to protect them once they've gotten under the skin? The first, and basically my main point on relational matters as critical ecological praxis that I want to bring across here is then the following, and we can of course continue the discussion later on that, because it's always a bit dense when one reads. Critical ecological thinking requires to face up first and foremost to a sincerely troubled space of coexistence, a vexed, ambivalent, entangled field, written and ridden by power, conflictual, never in equilibrium, and never once and for all fixed. Only by facing that quite inconvenient relational or ecological condition might we also gain the further insight that facing up to this condition will allow for a shift in what we call the field itself. And it allows us to foundationally question its taken for granted formatting with all the categorical splits and hierarchies always already in place. All those preset hierarchies that cannot but think the praxis of coexistence as either a violent encounter or a struggle, and thereby make killable everybody and everything considered other. In what remains here in this presentation, I would like to now turn to a few more concretized thought horizons, ecological in that complex relational sense, which for me enable the required defamiliarization of both the concept of relationality and the critical foundation of our thinking in view of a different ecological practice. And these are basically the points that I would really bring across still in the last bit that I'm doing here. I come back to them, you can just read them here, and there will be other slides to come. So first of all, to start undoing the framing splits and hierarchies that build Western metaphysics, I turn to Karen Barat's philosophical proposition of an agential realism. And it is always a great inspiration to me, because Barat's introduction, I hope that some of you have encountered their work. Barat's introduction of quantum field theory was never about a new scientific logic to be established, and thereby again to re-establish again a very Western-centric hegemony in philosophy. But in my reading, their use of quantum thinking is foundationally about the deconstruction of a Western metaphysics based on so-called laws of nature, which are, however, nothing but quite specific onto epistemic and cultural framings. And they are in no way coincidental, as we know, when put next to the colonization of the earth by the West. So what has become known as, and here it comes again, the ethico onto epistemological approach with Barat and other feminist new materialist thinkers is, in my eyes, always already a critical project. It is not a return to yet another fixed ontology in the sense of a categorically determining move. Rather, I see it as very complemental, or as a complementary way of thinking to the foundational critical tackling of our world that's pursued in anti or decolonial thinking. And this, I find authors here both in Caribbean studies, as I already said. I'm working very much with someone like Sylvia Winter, but of course in view of relation, also Edouard Glissant is very important, but also of course the Latin American decolonial tradition, Viveros de Castro, which we will hear about, de la Cadena and others. Western metaphysics, so to speak, is the coloniality of being, and developing a different cultivation of what supposedly are laws of nature is long overdue. And that is the first point, deconstruction of Western metaphysics as coloniality of being. This leads me now to a specific thinker, Denise Ferreira da Silva, Brazilian decolonial philosopher, as I want to call her, who here exemplary provides for me a horizon to practically shift from a thought based on categorical separation and split, the Western philosophical framing, and we can also even get more concrete, the Kantian Hegelian in particular, based on the delimitation of what is as understanding the world, towards a horizon of non-separability. In a short, but quite, in my eyes, effective text on difference without separability, maybe some of you know it, da Silva gives this approach for non-separability the following phrasing. What if, instead of the ordered world, which is the categorical understanding of the world, we imagined each existent, human and more than human, not as separate forms relating through the mediation of forces, but rather as singular expressions of each and every other existent, as well as of the entangled whole in or as which they exist. In such an expression logic, and there are surely Spinozian and Leibnizian resonances in da Silva's proposition, pushing through the framework of the ordered world is possible. And there is a conceptual opening towards a different relational ecological praxis of worlding. But for me now here, a very important point is to realize that that which is called here the ordered world, or also phrased as the categorical understanding of the world, in such a relational setting, cannot now be simply negated, left behind, abandoned, as if defeated. I hope I was up to here clear enough that such practice of critical thinking or ecological thinking doesn't suffice for what's envisioned as shift. Everything and everybody is a singular expression of each and every other existent, as well as of the entangled whole as which we exist. So a relational approach as ecological praxis requires a modus, maybe even we can call it a muscle, of shifting that no longer falls into the habit of easy categorical splitting and of choosing sides, even in cases when we can otherwise clearly distinguish colonial patriarchal capitalist moves from ecological praxis. Non-separability as critical ecological praxis requires another realization. And here I want to show something from a book called Hospicing Modernity, Facing Humanity's Wrongs and the Implication of Social Activism by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, also a Brazilian scholar, who I see very complementary to da Silva on a different level. And what she said, what is required is realizing our entanglement not only with the beautiful things in the world, but also with the saturated collective and individual shit of different forms of violence, greed, unprocessed traumas, harmful projects in addition, narcissism, hedonism, hyper-individualism, and consumerism in all its forms. It involves opening up to being taught by humanity's on modernity's wrongs. Such a relational opening up in our search for a less ecologically suicidal relation in critical thinking is what I take as the currently most consequential path. And I come back to the 3 points. So we had the praxeological impact of non-separability as philosophical horizon I spelled out with da Silva and de Oliveira. And now the last point, a different consequentiality. So such a relational opening up in our search for less ecologically suicidal relations in a critical thinking is what I take as the currently most consequential path to choose, also in the sense of a critical lesson to learn. In an ecological relational pluriverse, there's no ultimate turning away or opting out. We cannot just criticize the past and the present and believe in a brighter, more ecological or relational future. What's required is to now also live ecologically, that is relationally, with the shit. This asks from us to sincerely stay with the trouble, to use Donna Haraway's phrasing, which is not about resignation, but about engaging in a praxis enabling another imaginary of relational and ecological coexistence. And here again, I return now to my point that this praxis requires a different conceptual practice, one that finally doesn't forget anymore, as Haraway puts it, that it matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots not knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. I'm very convinced that these violent and ecologically deadly times require much more attention to how we think as a collective praxis. And there's, of course, always the activist sentiment that there's no time for this. And yet, if we want to truly disrupt current anthropogenic ecological suicidality, think we must. Donna Haraway has just received one of the highest scientific awards here in the Netherlands, the Erasmus Prize 2025. It was a very pleasant surprise given the times we're living in and the political situation we're having also here in the Netherlands. And in her carefully thought through award speech, she reminded me of this feminist statement again, think we must. And my very own work also on it in the context of our network in Terra Critica. And here today, and for the context of this colloquium of critical ecologies, I would like to add just to Virginia Woolf's 1938 statement, think we must, relationally. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Kathrin. We will do the conversation after Cristóbal's presentation. Okay?
Wonderful, yes.
¿Cómo hacemos con la...?
Si nos ves. Sí, está saliendo. Bueno, vamos a pasar a la segunda presentación del día, de esta mesa, perdón. Del día de hoy no, hay un montón. Nuestra próxima presentación es de Cristóbal Durán Rojas. Cristóbal es actualmente investigador asociado del Instituto de Estudios Humanísticos de la Universidad de Talca. Es también miembro de la Red de Estudios Latinoamericanos de Deleuze y Guattari. Ha publicado varios libros, el último de los cuales, que fue presentado ayer, es Imágenes Virales, el cine de David Cronenberg, por Metales Pesados. Es editor del libro Desear la Diferencia, Conversaciones con Félix Guattari, Encuentros en Chile en 1991, este año 2025. Y entre sus publicaciones más recientes sobre Deleuze y Guattari se encuentran los artículos The Contiguity of the Continuum, A Kafkian Leibniz y Un Continuum de Inhallables e Innombrables, La Alegría Disyuntiva de H.P. Lovecraft. Actualmente desarrolla una investigación sobre la posibilidad de un pluralismo en clave ecológica a partir del corpus deleuziano. Y su presentación se llama Un sistema sin ley, un posible multinaturalismo con Gilles Deleuze. Le agradecemos a Cristóbal y vamos a escucharlo.
Gracias. Gracias, Noelia. Gracias, Guada, por la invitación a poder estar en este coloquio que ha resultado maravilloso hasta ahora. Mi única duda es si hablo así fuerte directamente.
Tal vez
¿Se escucha?
Para que traduzca bien.
Ya. Lento, bien modulado y con buena prosode.
Neutro.
Ya, buena, sabroso. Bien. Empiezo entonces con un epígrafe. Voy a leer un texto lentamente, pero empiezo con un epígrafe que está en el texto de Deleuze sobre Lucrecio. El primer filósofo es naturalista, discurre sobre la naturaleza, en lugar de discurrir sobre los dioses. Tiene como encargo no introducir en filosofía nuevos mitos que retirarían a la naturaleza toda su positividad. Los dioses activos son el mito de la religión, como el destino es el mito de una falsa física, y el ser, lo uno, el todo, el mito de una falsa filosofía totalmente impregnada de teología. En más de un sentido, Deleuze es un pensador sistemático. Claro que su sistematicidad no puede ser dada de antemano y tiene que ser explicada. En un seminario dictado en 1956-57, titulado ¿Qué es fundar?, elabora una detallada discusión sobre considerar a la filosofía o bien como método o bien como sistema. Mientras el método exigiría centrarse en el modo en que se experimenta la realidad, el sistema expresa el ser mismo antes que nuestra experiencia de él. No es de extrañarse que en un texto tardío, más de 30 años después, en 1990, retome su interés por esta cuestión. En su carta prólogo a Jean-Claude Martin escribe lo siguiente: creo en la filosofía como sistema. La noción de sistema me disgusta cuando se remite a las coordenadas de lo idéntico, lo semejante y lo análogo. Creo que es Leibniz el primero que identifica la filosofía con el sistema. Yo me adhiero a esa identificación, en el sentido de Leibniz. Me considero un filósofo muy clásico. Para mí el sistema no solamente ha de estar en una heterogeneidad perpetua, sino que debe ser una heterogénesis, lo cual, creo, no se ha intentado nunca. La filosofía no es un trabajo de lectura, o mejor dicho, lo es siempre y cuando se trate de un trabajo de invención o creación de conceptos. Y para ello es preciso encontrar las condiciones en las cuales se produce algo nuevo, donde hay creatividad, como dice a propósito de Whitehead. Una génesis de algo nuevo. La idea de la filosofía como sistema depende, para Deleuze, de analizar estados de cosas, es decir, multiplicidades, hasta extraer de ellos conceptos. Y eso es, ante todo, determinar la naturaleza de las relaciones que parecieran ser inseparables unas de otras. Relaciones que se montan y se desmontan, dando tal o cual consistencia a dichas multiplicidades. Ahora bien, como lo dice el adagio que Deleuze descubre en Bergson, modificar cualquier elemento de una multiplicidad es hacerla cambiar de naturaleza, tener desde entonces otra cosa. Si la filosofía lidia con multiplicidades, la filosofía es una teoría de las multiplicidades, como explicita póstumamente, su sistematicidad solo cabría ser la de un sistema heterogéneo, un sistema alejado del equilibrio, dice, tal como entiende la lengua, o incluso, cito también, un agenciamiento heterogéneo en perpetuo desequilibrio. Al hablar de su relación con el cine, y luego de afirmar que los problemas filosóficos lo han llevado a buscar respuestas en el cine, a pesar de que estas respuestas supongan nuevos problemas, habla de un sistema de relevos, donde se inscribe así todo trabajo filosófico. Este sistema, entonces, bien podría ser algo así como un agenciamiento heterogéneo de relevos en perpetuo desequilibrio. Y si todavía avanzamos un poco más, habría que decir que esos relevos son situaciones muy concretas, como él mismo lo piensa, no antecedentes filosóficos ni conceptos dados, encontrados listos y resueltos en cierta historia. Cualquier concepto puro, por ejemplo el de multiplicidad, es inseparable del paso de una concreción a otra, como recuerda otra vez más en su carta a Martin. El filósofo debe darse el tiempo de volver a las percepciones y a los afectos que redoblan así los conceptos. En su texto de 1961 sobre Lucrecio y el naturalismo, publicado con modificaciones en 1969 como apéndice a Lógica del Sentido, bajo el título de Lucrecio y el simulacro, Deleuze ya se había enfrentado tempranamente a la cuestión del sistema. No se trataba ahí solo de un sistema definido por una perpetua heterogeneidad, sino que se trataba de poner en juego las condiciones que hacen posible pensar un sistema como heterogénesis, como generación de lo diverso. Lo que en su texto sobre Lucrecio se denomina naturaleza, con mayúscula, es lo que permitirá dibujar ese peculiar sistema que por años pareció perseguir a Deleuze. Cito: los productos de la naturaleza son inseparables de una diversidad, que les es esencial. Y ello apela ciertamente al hecho de tener que no subrogar esa diversidad a un principio unitario primero, del cual evidentemente no se podría derivar lo diverso. La cuestión difícil será, desde luego, pensar lo diverso como diverso. De ahí que lo que se llama naturaleza es, ante todo, una diversidad de mundos, según 3 puntos de vista. Los mundos son innumerables, a menudo de especies diferentes, a veces semejantes, pero siempre compuestos de elementos heterogéneos. Pero recordemos que no solo se trata de un sistema heterogéneo, sino de cómo dar cuenta de las condiciones de dicha heterogeneidad. Es decir, se debería tratar del principio de producción de lo diverso. Y es a ello a lo que con Lucrecio Deleuze denomina con mayúsculas justamente naturaleza. La naturaleza es entonces principio de producción de lo diverso. Y ese principio solo tiene sentido, dice Deleuze, si no reúne sus propios elementos en un todo. Es decir, ha de ser una suma infinita. Cito: una suma que no totalice sus propios elementos. Por esta razón, un sistema no puede ser una totalidad, sino más bien la razón de lo diverso, razón que ella misma ha de generar lo diverso. No es, desde luego, la naturaleza matematizada de los modernos, ni necesariamente la natura de los latinos. Physis, cito, no es una determinación de lo uno, del ser o del todo. La naturaleza, dirá Deleuze, no es colectiva, sino distributiva. Las federa naturae distribuyen partes que no se totalizan. Federación, alianza o unión antes que ley, pero no una unión que unifica, porque la naturaleza, dice también Deleuze, apoyándose en Lucrecio, cito, no es atributiva, sino conjuntiva. Se expresa en y, no en un es. Esto y eso, alternancias, entrelazamientos, semejanzas y diferencias, atracciones y distracciones, matices y brusquedades. Este principio parece basarse en al menos 2 premisas que lo sostienen. 1. Cualquier cosa puede nacer de cualquier cosa. 2. Cada cosa se puede transformar en otra. Y digámoslo muy rápidamente, esta completa soltura es lo que le confiere crédito a la idea lucreciana de que entre las cosas hay vacío. Un vacío que está dotado también de algún tipo de consistencia ontológica. Podríamos pensarlo también en la clave en la cual William James declaraba, contra su lectura del empirismo humeano, que lo que conecta o relaciona es también objeto lícito y digno de experiencia. Y mencionamos a James precisamente porque en el texto de Deleuze del 61, y también en Lógica del Sentido, también se tratará de aquello que le llama la atención del empirismo de tipo superior, que luego llamará trascendental. Es decir, de un mundo que es una suma, pero no un todo. Cito: un manto de arlequín totalmente hecho de llenos y de vacíos, de llenos y de vacío, de seres y de no ser, poniéndose cada uno de ellos como ilimitado al tiempo que limita al otro. Tomaré para servirme de ellos, 2 lugares en los cuales Deleuze hace referencia a este manto o traje de arlequín. En ambos casos se trata de pensar una composición dotada de una consistencia distributiva. A propósito de Hume, pero evidentemente leído de la mano del empirismo radical de William James, un mundo de exterioridad sería un mundo en donde la conjunción y destrona la interioridad del verbo ser. Un mundo de arlequín abigarrado y hecho de fragmentos no totalizables, en donde la comunicación procede mediante relaciones exteriores. También a propósito de James y de su filosofía mosaico, en la cual, al igual que los mosaicos reales, las piezas se mantienen juntas gracias a su soporte, Deleuze piensa en Melville. Un Melville que fácilmente podremos leer a contrapelo en el juego lucreciano. Con ese espíritu cito a continuación: Esto es un pasaje que está en el ensayo sobre Melville, que está en Crítica y Clínica. Se trata, en primer lugar, de la afirmación de un mundo en proceso, en archipiélago, ni siquiera un rompecabezas cuyas piezas, al adaptarse, reconstruirían un todo, sino más bien una pared seca de piedras libres, no cimentadas, donde cada elemento vale por sí mismo y en relación con los demás, conjuntos aislados y relaciones flotantes, islas e islotes, puntos móviles y líneas sinuosas, pues la verdad siempre tiene las lindes hechas trizas. No un cráneo, sino una retahíla de vértebras, una médula espinal, no un vestido uniforme, sino un traje de arlequín, incluso blanco sobre fondo blanco, un patchwork de continuación infinita de empalmes múltiples. Hasta ahí la cita. Esta descripción dada para el mundo de la experiencia y que podemos encontrar en un arco temático de preocupaciones que van desde los años 50 en adelante, está, como hemos visto, en la caracterización del naturalismo de Lucrecio. El naturalismo, en cuanto sistema, no reúne las causas en un todo, pero ello no quita que cuente con un principio de causalidad fuertemente estructurado que explica la producción de lo diverso. Pero lo explica, como dice Deleuze, como composiciones, combinaciones diversas y no totalizables entre elementos de la naturaleza. En el complejo diseño de una especie de sistema de la naturaleza en el cual es posible distinguir entre emanaciones provenientes de las profundidades de los cuerpos, simulacros que surgen de la superficie de dichos cuerpos y fantasmas cuya velocidad les permite adquirir un máximo de independencia con respecto a esos cuerpos, Lucrecio va dibujando una teoría de los cambios de velocidad que van revelando la producción de elementos autónomos respecto a la fijeza y pesadez de los cuerpos. Estos elementos que van ganando autonomía al verse liberados de dichos cuerpos contribuyen paradójicamente a componer un sistema de la naturaleza, que lejos de consistir en la mera fragmentación en términos dispersos e indiferentes unos a otros, busca la manera de explicitar la formación de lo nuevo y el cuidado de las diferencias en dicha formación. Ese panorama que se compone entre dominios de imágenes y capas de emanaciones que texturizan a la naturaleza como inmediatamente plural, desdoblándose entre sí en la afirmación de cada una de sus diferencias, en esa suma infinita con la que Lucrecio saludaba con asombro a la naturaleza, se devuelve con fuerza en la reflexión sobre el multinaturalismo que Viveiros de Castro subraya como rasgo determinante de las epistemologías y ontologías de algunos pueblos amerindios. El multinaturalismo es, ante todo, una manera con la cual poner en entredicho y contestar la tesis de una pretendida unidad del mundo. En el caso de lo propuesto por el antropólogo brasileño, se trata de una multiplicidad heterogénea la que dicta la pluralidad de mundos y sus divergencias. A partir de ello, se puede advertir una inconmensurabilidad en el modo en que se comprende la invención moderna, y no solo moderna, podríamos decir, de la naturaleza, lo que nos fuerza también a enfrentarnos a un necesario desmontaje de su integridad y de su unidad. Resumo rápidamente algunas breves cuestiones en virtud de asentar algunos puntos. Según el examen que hace de los pueblos amerindios que considera, cada viviente se ve a sí mismo como humano. Es más, es el modo de ser de todos los entes. Serían las diferencias corporales las que dan lugar a perspectivas divergentes. Ese es el perspectivismo obviamente amerindio que considera Viveiros de Castro. Es de este modo que se puede afirmar que hay una sola cultura y muchas naturalezas, y que eso da razón de que no hay unidad posible de dichos mundos, que por definición divergen constantemente entre sí. Nuestra costumbre de definirnos en una partición entre la especie humana y una gran masa más o menos indiferenciada que incluye, cito, a todas las otras especies y todos los otros pueblos en una alteridad privativa común, es lo que nos permite poner al otro con alto grado de homogeneidad. De este modo, podría decirse, uno de los aspectos más relevantes en la distinción mayúscula entre cultura y naturaleza es el hecho de considerar a esta última como un bloque. Precisamente el caso de la expresión multinaturalismo busca revocar la idea europeizante de multiculturalismo, que se construye sobre la base de una radical unicidad de la naturaleza. La naturaleza moderna, como lo describe también Viveiros de Castro, debe su unidad a la supuesta, y cito, universalidad objetiva de los cuerpos y de la sustancia. Mientras que, por otro lado, las culturas son pensadas, y vuelvo a citar, en su anclaje en la particularidad subjetiva de los espíritus y los significados. Es precisamente este último esquema lo que discutiría radicalmente la concepción amerindia. Habría más bien una unidad del espíritu y una diversidad de los cuerpos. En términos pragmáticos, si el multiculturalismo aspira a operar sobre protocolos de intercambio de perspectivas que tienen que reconocerse en última instancia en la unidad de lo humano, el multinaturalismo no quisiera contar con el presupuesto de la unificación de dos o más mundos, a partir de una medida trascendente que invariablemente actúa sobre la base de una discriminación entre sus respectivos habitantes. Para el caso del multinaturalismo, esa unidad del humano no se pondría en juego en la jerarquización entre mundos, sino más bien en el hecho de que, cito, es humano todo ser que ocupe la posición de sujeto cosmológico. Todo existente puede ser pensado como pensante. Existe, luego piensa. Es decir, como activado o agentado por un punto de vista. En cuanto humano, un jaguar o un pecarí, dice Viveiros de Castro, son otra cosa, lo que confiere a la idea misma de humano una diferencia interna, dada precisamente por su potencia física. Todo humano es así, por definición, diferente de sí. Ese es el sentido de la relación entre perspectivismo y multinaturalismo en lo que propone Viveiros de Castro. Cito: ser capaz de ocupar un punto de vista es sin duda una potencia del alma, y los no humanos son sujetos en la medida en que tienen o son un espíritu. Pero la diferencia entre los puntos de vista, y un punto de vista no es otra cosa que una diferencia, no está en el alma. Está formalmente idéntica en todas las especies. Esta formalmente idéntica en todas las especies percibe solamente la misma cosa en todas partes. La diferencia entonces debe ser dada por la especificidad de los cuerpos. Los animales ven del mismo modo que nosotros cosas diferentes de las que vemos nosotros, porque sus cuerpos son diferentes de los nuestros. Diferentes en la medida en que la diferencia se juega en los efectos que singularizan cada especie de cuerpo, sus fuerzas y sus debilidades. El cuerpo es entonces, y cito, un conjunto de maneras y de modos de ser que constituyen un hábitos, un ethos, un ethograma. Ni esencialismo espiritual, ni sustancialismo material de los organismos, es más bien en consideración una especie de manierismo corporal, como lo denomina Viveiros de Castro. La naturaleza es así, de este modo, el nombre de esa univocidad del ser, si lo decimos en la clave del espinosismo deleuziano, uno en cada una de sus diferencias. Un manto de singularidades conectadas conjuntiva o disyuntivamente, formando individuaciones que no por mantener regularidades dejan de excederlas o escaparles. El naturalismo lucreciano ¿no era acaso un preámbulo para la idea de un multinaturalismo? De hecho, Viveiros de Castro lo dice de modo extremadamente oportuno cuando nos dice que entre el multinaturalismo amerindio y el multiculturalismo antropológico habría dos modos muy distintos de conjugación de lo múltiple. Este último, una pluralidad definida por una multiplicidad de culturas. Por el otro, la multiplicidad en la cultura en cuanto multiplicidad. Y leo una cita para terminar. Obviamente el trabajo queda absolutamente abierto. Aquí la noción de multinaturalismo resulta útil por su carácter paradójico. Como nuestro macroconcepto de naturaleza no admite un verdadero plural, eso nos lleva espontáneamente a tomar conciencia del solecismo ontológico contenido en la idea de varias naturalezas y por consiguiente a realizar el desplazamiento correctivo que esto impone. Parafraseando la fórmula de Deleuze sobre el relativismo, diríamos entonces que el multinaturalismo amazónico no afirma tanto una variedad de naturalezas como la naturalidad de la variación como naturaleza. Gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias Cristóbal, muchas gracias Kathrin. Bueno, Kathrin, quiero chequear que vos, mientras habló Cristóbal, ¿podías entender a través del subtitulado lo que él estaba diciendo o te costó?
Yes, somewhat. It's a very funny transcription, but I think yes. Somewhat I understood the gist of things.
No, I was asking because to understand if we have to speak to you in English or we may speak to you in Spanish. What do you prefer?
I would think raising questions in English would be better, because the transcription makes it very confusing sometimes. So then.
Okay. Great.
But if it's not possible, maybe someone can just translate here also, So I think your translations probably are better than this translation.
Yes, okay. Bueno, vamos a abrir el espacio de preguntas. Bien, si tienen alguna pregunta, si no, yo tengo. Ok. Voy a hacerla primero en español y después en inglés, porque es para los dos. Bueno, primero quiero decir que me encanta esta mesa porque es como coincide mucho con mis propios problemas teóricos. Kathrin, el tema de Kathrin es prácticamente el mismo tema que yo trabajé el primer coloquio anterior, también preocupada por la cuestión de la relacionalidad, y me gusta mucho cómo las dos ponencias desde distintos lugares abordan la misma cuestión que, bueno, cómo pensar de nuevo la relacionalidad y con lo que eso para nuestra tradición supone, que es pensar la totalidad en algún sentido y todos los nombres históricos que se le fue dando a ese total, que se puede llamar también mundo o universal, digamos, fue adquiriendo diferentes denominaciones como a lo largo de la historia filosófica, y que ahora hay que volver a repensarlo en términos también esto de la relacionalidad sistémica, que podemos llamar, como llamaba Kathrin, ecología. Entonces, eso creo que hay mucho para pensar cruzadamente entre sus ponencias, entre sus presentaciones, y la pregunta, y esto quizás tiene más que ver con mis propias indagaciones, y por eso les quería preguntar, a ver si me ayudan, que es, porque de diferentes maneras creo que los dos había como una inserción también materialista de la discusión. Sí. En el caso de Cristóbal, directamente por Lucrecio y el materialismo antiguo. Y creo yo, en el caso de Kathrin, bueno, porque vos hablabas, Kathrin, de Varas y de los nuevos materialismos, y sé que también trabajás esas fuentes. Entonces, quería preguntarles a los dos cómo, o si tienen algún pensamiento referido a como una perspectiva materialista, debería quizás aclarar materialista no dialéctica, creo, coincide o los ayuda a pensar este problema que quieren pensar. Kathrin, should I translate all the question, or have you understand something of what I have just said?
Most of it I could fully follow. Just if you would, the last bit, so that I have the question okay. Extremely clear. Because could you say something from your perspectives? Clarify something about materialism as non-dialectical. Is that the question?
Yes. If you could maybe share with us your thoughts about how a materialistic point of view helps or not with your approach to this problem. So that would be the question, but of course you may share your thoughts. Do you want to speak first, Kathrin?
Maybe we start from the room. I think start from the room first.
Okay.
Yeah. Bien. Sí. Es interesante porque en el trabajo de Deleuze, que a mí me interesa hace mucho tiempo, ese punto en Deleuze es el problema del todo, o de los todos, que en primera instancia pareciera ser algo que Deleuze rechaza permanentemente, pero evidentemente no es tan no están así. Entonces, eso coincide mucho con lo que tú dices respecto a, bueno, en el caso de Deleuze yo vería justamente un pensamiento muy sistemático, como él mismo dice, que trata de alguna manera de reinscribir ciertos conceptos para producir otra sistematicidad. Deleuze siempre dice, yo soy un filósofo en un sentido muy tradicional. Y a eso se refiere, pero es muy tradicional en el sentido de que, bueno, vamos a leer a Lucrecio porque vamos a evitar, por ejemplo, la dialecticidad hegeliana entre elementos o términos, y vamos entonces a preocuparnos de Lucrecio porque en Lucrecio hay un pensamiento, por ejemplo, de los simulacros, de las emanaciones o de los fantasmas, que es precisamente una manera de considerar que no hay individuos terminados, no hay elementos acabados, no hay términos cerrados, y la relacionalidad tendría que ver justamente con dar cuenta de esos, ¿cómo decirlo?, pasajes o transiciones o variaciones que definen justamente a los términos. Eso es lo que yo podría decir. Entonces, Lucrecio es una pieza importantísima, por ejemplo, para releer algunas cuestiones que están en Bergson, algunas cuestiones que están obviamente en Nietzsche, también en todo el caso del horizonte deleuziano, pero claro, yo lo que vengo tratando de hacer hace bastante tiempo es mostrar que eso que uno llama relacionalidad, en el caso de la construcción sistemática deleuziana, tiene que ver con cómo se compone la relacionalidad. Y en ese sentido, a propósito de lo que decía Kathrin, es muy interesante porque justamente por ejemplo, lo que uno llamaría una ontología relacional no es suficiente si no da cuenta entonces de cómo se arman y desarman las relacionalidades. Y eso es la teoría de las multiplicidades, básicamente. No sé si dije algo, pero... algo, sí.
Should I continue? Thanks so much, Cristóbal. I mean, of course, it's a very big question. And coming also from a very Deleuzian, in that sense, first direction where I come from also, and having then turned more to even more relational thinkers, I would say, because I think there's a difference between the tradition of what you also spoke very much about, the systemicity of heterogeneity, and that more maybe charged relational ontological realm of thinking that I do believe, and here I come back to Noelia's, to your question, has actually a similar impetus as, say, materialism in the dialectical version, because it is about transformation. It is really about toppling, bringing something down, so to speak, transforming something really. And in that sense, I constantly in exchange also here with more materialist thinkers from the more Marxian materialisms and the dialectical materialism. What I do nonetheless think, if we think dialectics with what I try to bring across as this foundational relationality, then I think dialectics has already undergone a rereading from what we classically hear about dialectics or what we classically know about dialectics. Because also when I think about I know that such readings of Hegel or Hegelian or Marx is possible, but most of the time I would say when we think it in terms of this ecological way of thinking, that also dialectics starts first from a separation and then coming into a relation. And I want to really make this, I really want to make this very clear that in a relational systemicity, there is no way of having a before that is individualized. And the coming to being of the individual is a process of relationality and does not leave the relational field. And then, because one starts from because dialectics sees as the problem of how to get in a relation or how to solve that relation, as I say, relational is introduced always as a problem to be solved or as something, as a solution or as something that is a process. And there I see that we get not, and this is now when I think about our contemporary, about the contemporary world, so to speak, where my thinking as a feminist always takes issue with what I think we, of course, should, I would always link it to in a some way revolutionary or radical dialectical approach, but it has to go one step deeper, I would say, or one step more foundational, that the field is much more blurred and much more messy. And it is not to be solved. It is to be lived otherwise. It is to be practiced otherwise. And so there I feel like is a friction for me. I see with the more dialectical traditions of materialisms and say, for example, the more new materialist, or also, as I say, and I see it very much as a when I bring in Denise Ferreira da Silva, or when I bring in Karen Barad or new materialists and Sylvia Winter, I see it really as something that tries to also allow that this relational field can be approached from a foundational different perspective, namely as always already relational and as never something else than relational. And from that to make, to ask the political question, what is needed to get into otherwise relations is different from how to get into relation to begin with.
Thanks, Kathrin. Guadalupe.
Well, I have a question for Kathrin. It is, I don't know if you're listening to me or... Yes, okay. It is on the idea of an ethical obligation on relationship, on the relationality, and you were talking about Hannah Arendt there. So I would like to, because I am quite interested now on how to think with Hannah Arendt again in this context. So I would like to know how do you think that idea of how to think again, the idea of thinking and acting in Hannah Arendt in this context of relationality and the problem of the ethics in an ontology of relationality.
This is really now thinking from the top of my head, because I, as I just said, today is her 50th anniversary when she died, and I read this very long article about her, and I saw just a film about her, which I really can recommend. It's a documentary called Hannah Arendt Facing Tyranny. It was done this year. And there, I think you would also get more answers to this. So what I always liked about Hannah Arendt's thought is very influential for me earlier on in my life. Certainly also, as a citizen from Germany, her way of having written the Eichmann process, the Eichmann report, was extremely important for me in the question of what it means to think. And I feel that is maybe one of the earliest formulations for me that she, in what I now said with Virginia Woolf, think we must, she would say, like, we always have to think. And it is the most detrimental if thinking doesn't happen. And she says exactly, Eichmann shows the non-existence of thought. And that is something that she connects with, biggest catastrophes. And I would also, that's why I also, of course, write at the moment the way I presented this to you, because I'm very much involved in Palestine support, and in the way, how do we face up to what is we are witnessing or what is happening. And I do think that her emphasis of thinking goes always beyond a division between she is unplaceable between the right and the wrong, the good and the evil, and between right and right or left. And as much as that's also sometimes a weakness when one reads Hannah Arendt, and you know, as I also say, I mean, she takes a lot from the Kantian tradition, and her reading of Kant as this how to think is, I find, very important. I don't particularly find it so much in Kant, but that's Hannah Arendt to me. So her way of saying that thinking is one of the worlding practices in which we world our world, that I find extremely connectable to what I'm trying to do in this ecological way of rewriting also the ideational field of what is called thinking. And I think it is very similar to what she said about that thinking is an action. It is not something, I call it a practice. I think it's always something that I do corporeally, and that it really does make a shift if I have read something, or if I would not take account of it, if I go back to the canon, or if I try to find something else that might kind of take me out of my habits of thinking. And that does also something how I encounter the world. And there I think there is, Hannah Arendt is actually a strong voice, a very good voice for me. Yet he is very committed to the understanding of the world. And, you know, precisely there, I would say that is on a more foundational level, precisely when we think it in terms of the CPC, you know, colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, that's precisely holding the ordered world in place. And that would be, I think, I would always struggle with her on this, that understanding the world and really being able to understand it is maybe something that with someone like Glissant or others we can, you know, rethink. Probably, I would say Hannah Arendt has the capacity to always shift her thinking. I mean, that's also something that I find really important. So I don't know what she would right now say about what is needed qua what we are facing up to and how you know, I don't know, that I cannot say, but I would say the potential for this kind of thinking as a life, as a living. And that I think is very similar to how I always also read Deleuze. You know, that thinking is the question of life. And that links it more to something else. And I feel there, Hannah Arendt herself is much more radical or much more transgressive than the vocabulary or the kind of the sources she uses, which I very much appreciate. Make sense?
Yes, excellent, Kathrin.
Cristóbal.
Habla fuerte.
Va dirigida a Cristóbal. Fuerte.
Neutro.
Neutro, claro.
Fuerte y neutro.
No te iba a preguntar por el trasfondo lucreciano del asunto que estás planteando tú. Bueno, en primera instancia con el concepto de naturaleza que podría haber ahí, pero sobre todo con la idea que pudiera estar de fondo para pensar la cuestión combinatoria.
Sí.
O sea, la composición.
Sí.
Porque parece que no está explícito, así como tampoco, o no sé, tal vez tú lo tienes más visto, el elemento, digamos, la definición del elemento en juego, porque claro, ya estoy pensando en el modelo que está de fondo en Lucrecio, que viene del atomismo,
Sí.
de Demócrito Epicuro, y la combinación se piensa, en analogía uno podría decir, cómo se combinan las letras de las palabras, ¿no?
Claro.
Esa cuestión como de fondo, pero que en verdad, más allá de la metáfora que podría significar, parece ser un presupuesto bastante programático en Lucrecio mismo, ¿no? Y ahí un poco se explica la cuestión combinatoria o el elemento en el juego, ¿no? Como para darle una consistencia, porque claro, el elemento puede ser...
Sí.
Y claro, no sé si Deleuze tiene eso ahí cuando está ahí o...
Sí, yo creo que...
O tiene otro criterio de síntesis, perdón.
Sí,
Perdón, y agrego a esto todo el problema del vacío.
No, claro.
Sí.
Escrito, ¿no?
Claro.
Bueno, pero es que traté de meter muchas cosas en 4 palabras. No, pero antes de sacarme los balazos anticipadamente, sí, la cuestión de la combinatoria es sumamente importante en el caso de lo que estoy considerando, porque eso es lo que da cuenta justamente de una lógica distributiva del juego, es decir, justamente de lo que va a apuntalar cómo se constituye, cómo adquiere consistencia lo que se va a llamar un sistema. ya no necesariamente en el sentido de Lucrecio, sino cómo va a entender Deleuze la cuestión del sistema, no solo con Lucrecio, sino con Hume, con William James, con Melville, etcétera, etcétera. Sí, hay una cuestión interesante a propósito de lo que tú dices, que claro, es tu preocupación que tiene que ver justamente con la combinatoria de las palabras, claramente, pero que es interesante porque tiene que ver con, y ahí me desvío un poco con la lectura que hace Deleuze de Foucault leyendo a Lucero, que es justamente eso lo que está en juego, es como cómo armar un sistema a partir de una combinatoria que no sea totalizable, cómo construir un infinito a partir de algo que justamente no sea un falso infinito. Y ahí la cuestión del vacío, que en el caso, en el texto en las dos versiones del texto de Deleuze sobre Lucrecio, es sumamente importante, pero el desarrollo es muy escueto también, ¿no? Es como, no queda muy claro si el vacío tiene que aparecer justamente con cierta dignidad ontológica para dar cuenta justamente, en términos, digamos así, estructuralistas, para que se muevan los elementos. Claro. Si el vacío actúa de alguna forma como un elemento en ese sentido, y yo tengo la impresión de que sí, esa cuestión es algo que tengo que explorar porque esa es la lectura que está haciendo desde muy temprano del empirismo, justamente. Y ahí mi hipótesis, que yo tengo una hipótesis al respecto que es fuerte ahí, cuando Deleuze está leyendo a Hume, no está leyendo a Hume, sino que está leyendo a William James. Y eso es demostrable históricamente también, porque fue Jean Valjean el que le dijo a través de Hippolyte, bueno, tienes que hacer la tesis sobre Hume, y tienes que hacer la tesis sobre Hume mientras yo estoy escribiendo los libros sobre William James, y todas las cosas que dice Deleuze sobre Hume, las cosas como metodológicas, digamos así, las cosas que no están en el texto de Hume, son cuestiones que dice Jean Valjean sobre William James. Bueno, está en curso la cosa, pero es como, uno podría decir, claro, cómo se construye una sistematicidad elemental basada en procesos distributivos y no necesariamente como alternativa justamente a la cuestión de la totalización. El anti-hegelianismo deleuziano.
Claro, porque también para mí, porque vos hablabas de archipiélago,
sí,
¿no? Y ahí también es muy importante,
sí,
porque yo también quizás uno podría pensar como fuerza diferenciadora,
sí,
¿no?
Sí.
En el sentido ese de que no sé si hace falta el espacio vacío como en términos de elemento, porque
sí,
lo que tenés es como el permanente
sí,
correrse, ¿no? Que es como esa fuerza diferenciadora. No sé si alcanza, por eso era mi duda también.
Sí.
O sea, si también el vacío estaba ahí presente,
Sí.
vos estás diciendo que sí, que tiene
Sí.
que estar.
Sí, tiene que estar y está presente, pero creo también que por esa misma razón que tú estás planteando a propósito del archipiélago, y uno podría decir qué es lo que hay entre medio de las piezas del patchwork, lo que hace que lo que genera la discreción o la distinción en el patchwork, entre los elementos que componen el patchwork. Yo creo que por esa misma razón es que Deleuze no le dedica tanto al vacío. Esa es mi idea.
Además hay otra cuestión que para mí es el continuismo. O sea, ¿hay
Sí,
continuo o
sí.
no hay continuo? Porque si hay una afirmación del vacío, no se puede plantear un continuo como tal, entiendo yo. No sé. Por ahí
Sí, se puede.
Se puede igual.
Sí.
Vos decís, bueno.
Sí. Tiene que ver con la cuestión.
Para mí es como lo incompatible.
En el final de Rizoma dice una cuestión muy bonita que tiene que ver habla de las orillas y el fondo, y dice las orillas, en el fondo las orillas del río son el fondo. De alguna manera es eso, es su manera de pensar el continuo.
Bueno,
entonces
pero
los bordes son el continuo. Claro, eso vuelve más difícil la cuestión, creo yo.
sí.
Y es por eso que no se mete tanto por eso el vacío aparece es como una página en el texto sobre Lucrecio, y en general el vacío no es probablemente por lo que tú planteaste.
Yo tengo una pregunta por ahí, es más bien general porque llegué tarde, disculpo. Pero me quedaba pensando en el sintagma pueblos amerindios, como parte de ese binomio posicional. Si pensamos que es lo que estaría del otro lado, es algo parecido a los pueblos originarios en contraposición a Occidente. Y siguiendo este mismo marco, siempre que hay un binomio, uno de los términos está subjerarquizado por sobre el otro. Entonces pensaba, discutíamos también con un colega mapuche respecto de estos términos como que generalizan los pueblos que están por fuera de Occidente. Te quería preguntar por eso, si pensás algo sobre esa generalización, pensando justamente en términos de diferencia, cómo opera la diferencia cuando se habla sin la apegación a un nombre propio, englobando a todos los pueblos.
Claro, cuando uno lee a Ribeiro de Castro, estoy pensando aquí en metafísicas caníbales, obviamente hay muchos momentos en los que él habla, dice los pueblos amerindios, o dice las culturas amazónicas o el pueblo amazónico, y uno dice, está reconstruyendo justamente la misma cuestión que él está tratando de deshacer. Pero claro, también uno podría decir, y él hace ese mismo juego en el texto también, ese dualismo es para reconstruir otra cuestión, ya no es solamente un binomio oposicional que dé cuenta de que hay una relación jerárquica, sino que dice, bueno, lo que hay que hacer es pasar, por así decir, el multiculturalismo de la antropología por el lado del multinaturalismo amerindio. Y él menciona, obviamente, y dice, bueno, yo lo que estoy haciendo en este texto es juntar un montón de trabajo antropológico que tiene que ver con distintos pueblos, que tiene que ver con distintas relaciones, con distintos bordes, con distintos límites. Entonces, ahí, claro, se relativiza de otra manera el otro. El otro ya no es el otro hay una multiplicidad, digámoslo así, continua, no completamente discreta entre maneras de entender lo que a él le interesa resaltar, que tiene que ver con el perspectivismo, básicamente. Sí.
¿Puedo decir algo de eso? O sea, a mí me parece que igual hay como un juego metodológico respecto de la antropología clásica que tiene como sujeto de estudio a estos pueblos amerindios, o sea, lo fija como sujeto de estudio, y la gracia es como decir, este histórico objeto de estudio, ahora vamos a hacer un movimiento donde lo vamos a transformar en la estructura misma del pensamiento.
Claro.
Y por eso yo creo que se mantiene también, o a lo mejor ahí también hay una razón de por qué se mantiene.
Claro, y ahí dice, eso se parece al empirismo trascendental deleuziano. Claro, porque hace
la trascendentalización.
Claro, sí, es la...
del objeto clásico.
Claro.
Una especie de esencialismo estratégico, podríamos
decir. Metodológico.
Sí, metodológico. Sí.
Un lapso de esencialismo que habría que dejar.
Creo que en el sintagma pueblos originarios es todavía peor.
Sí.
En el sentido de a qué origen se está.
Claro, está la cuestión de claro, y por eso nunca habla de originario en ese sentido.
Sí.
Habla de amerindios, de culturas.
Quizás lo que me hace ruido es cuando se dice amerindio, cuál es el sujeto de enunciación que referencia, porque el indio era el indio para el colonizador.
Claro, por eso es el histórico objeto de estudio de la antropología.
Sí.
Claro.
Diría yo.
Sí.
I will ask Kathrin a question, because I very much like the emphasis, how you emphasize the conflict inherent to relational to a relational ecology or to a relational ontology, and I think that in that way your presentation, it was very good to program your presentation with Cristóbal together, because what I would like to ask you is, how do you think about this conflict involved in the relational ontology regarding different kinds of ecosystems, if you would like to think them in that way? Because you mentioned this feminist, this Brazilian feminist, and other thinkers. Some of them you mentioned are deconstructing Western metaphysics, and they approach the issue of the coloniality of being but I think that deconstructing the coloniality of being involves also taking into account the conflict that arrives with the multiplicity of ontologies also, that I think is implicit in your line of thinking. So maybe if you could share some of your thoughts about this problem.
Maybe I can also give this question a little bit back to others here, and also to in relation to Cristóbal's your Deleuzian and Viveros de Castro understanding, because this multiplicity or this I'm struggling with this, to be very honest, at the moment, because I thought we can speak of a relational ontology and for a long time, and I used also that terminology very much, and I still use it. I mean, it's not that I'm no longer thinking in this way, but precisely because of the multiplicity, and precisely because our interventions are necessarily perspectival and always tended towards something. It's indeed a relational ontology seems that everything fits a whole, basically, that in the end it's relational, it's just an ontology that is relational. An ontology, if you would be able to think it outside of the question of the whole, then, I think Cristóbal said this very much, I feel, in your presentation. I would also think that Deleuze exactly, or also the Lucretian, and also the especially then there, I would be interested hearing more about how Viveros de Castro exactly does it. But I do not have one philosophical answer to your question, Noelia. I think I can only say that for me it is extremely important that we do understand that there are always these conflicts, and that it is exactly that what it is. And I would go that far indeed with Viveros de Castro or with non-Western epistemologies to say, like, there are multiple. There's not just one world. There is, an indefinite. Now, but I don't know if I would say indefinite, but there is more than there's a multiplicity, and they are not even only in relation as separate worlds being in relation, but they are entangled, but they're also differentiated, and that will never add up. And that's why, for me, relationality is such a important issue, dealing with the complexity of that, that I would say that understanding, and then choosing how I intervene into that, and in a perspectival manner, address something. And I'm from here where I'm situated, I am addressing very much that. Very often in the Western tradition, as I say, relation and relationality is seen as, oh, that would kind of solve things, and people, if I would learn to do that, then we would not kill the other. Whereas I would think like that is just turning it around and not undoing the field itself. But I do think that from other, from a different angle, the problem of relationality manifests itself very differently. And there, I would say, I would like to know more from, I would like to just hear more about that then, always, because I think if we then listen to each other, if one listens in philosophy also really, or in thinking really to each other, one can still see how this is not just completely separate, but it is also entangled within the making of our own world in the plural. So, and this is indeed how this is what I would say to that. More, I think I cannot say, because it is a very, the conflict, I do not know what conflict, there is conflictual, but I do also think that we have a very specific idea about conflictuality, and that idea is always that it is a conflict that always has to be resolved. Maybe conflictual is not the problem. Maybe we have to learn, if you want to ask finally other questions, then we might want to also think that conflictual is what we have to deal with. And again, coming maybe back to Hannah Arendt in that moment, just because it's in my mind right now, that conflict that she had to be, on the one hand, for a place where Jewish people can go who were driven out of Europe and other places, and at the same time knowing that there is Palestine, that is of course not an empty country, but it has a people and has its own life. That conflict is something we have to, that is a conflict that she always felt she has to deal with, And that is something that we right now also have to deal with, and it is conflictual. But does it have to be deadly? Is the question that I at least would like to have open on a level of thinking, because we see surely on the world that it is a question of life and death only, but it is not something that I would like to limit. And for that, I find these more relational ways of thinking. I think also a different understanding to the other as the Amerindians, etc., is important to learn that we can ask other questions that might translate into a practice otherwise. But I would be interested, Cristóbal, because I think I said when I spoke about the existential condition of relationality, I go more and more into the question of that terminology rather than thinking purely as an ontology, because can we get out of an ontology that is not always also fixing something in its place, even a relational ontology, even the way you also spoke about it. And that's really something that, if you can say something about that, would be lovely.
I have also a question for you, Kathrin, because it's my way to return to your own. You said something in your presentation that is very important for my own research. You called something like the praxeological impact of non-separability as philosophical horizon. And my question is, which is the status of critique in this non-separability? Because you speak also of the necessity of a critical thought or practice. And which is the status of critique? Because critique is a word that is always associated with separability, separation, and yeah. On my own research, it's very difficult to focus on the critique, construct a critical way of thinking that is capable of take on his own charge the problem of non-separability. This is
yes. And maybe come closer to the question of ontology here, which I still would like you to say something about from Viveiros de Castro's perspective. But I think, yes, I fully understand your question, and I would say that indeed my intervention into critique is precisely to undo that separation, because, and that's why I see that it's a longer. The feminist tradition of critical thinking, or the feminist tradition, is always one that sees critique not as taking place between the criticizing subject and the to be criticized object, but as something that tries to change structures. And that's the heritage I'm speaking of when I speak of critical thinking, or when I speak of critique. And again. But I find your question very important in that sense that I didn't specify this, because indeed critique is normally that exactly, emphasizing the possibility to separate out. And that's exactly what I would say with a relational understanding, with an ecological understanding. Criticality is something different. And for me, it is maybe that what Dana Haraway says with truly staying with the trouble. To not, and maybe that has something to do with what Glissant would call as a right to opacity. And it's not being content with this, but a critique is not finding the solution of the problem, but critique is the exposing ourselves to that. And that does not mean that we can stop there, but it will always, I think, if we allow such way of doing critical thinking, I think we will not stop there. And I think all the authors that are here on the table in this panel today, I think have shown this, or show that it is not, and that I also find in other ways ecological, how to deal with climate catastrophe, how to deal with more sustainability. It's often that we have to criticize and then do better. And that actually repeats the cycle of violence, it repeats the cycle of domination, it repeats the cycle of extraction. Because we don't get outside of that box of how we, this is why I say how we do that. And so we have to also transform how our critique, what it aims for. And for me, critique, first of all, aims for exposing that a complexity, which I also want to say is always more than two-sided. It's not about choosing sides per se, even if we have to do this on other levels. But there we come, and this is why I want to go back, because there we come, I think, to that critique is not based on a fixed world that has one ontology, but it's actually worlding itself. It is worlding itself a world or different worlds. So there is, and the ontological is not disappearing. I would say, I want to nearly say, critique for me, I'm using it in some way ontologically, because it is a transformative power. It's a force. It's something that does something. And thus it also worlds. And yet I would not want to say it's an ontology, because as I say, there is always this, as if there is something that is something. And how do we get out? And even if we say relational ontology as a process ontology, is this really, and it's a real question, because I really like the works that, that do all this. But do we get away from this, that there is a world that has an ontology, and now we call it relational, not categorical, or,
¿Cómo era la pregunta? Sorry, I forgot your question, Kathrin.
Just, how does Viveros de Castro? I mean, I know about Deleuze. I mean, I feel like with the Deleuzean, yes. But how does how do you understand? Because when you speak about Viveros de Castro's, perspectivalism with Amerindianism, then how do you think in that problem? How do you think Viveros de Castro finds a way out or finds a way? How would you respond from a Viveros de Castro perspective to that problem?
I think that Viveros de Castro make a huge contribution to the construction or reconstruction of nature that Deleuze is pointing or focusing on Lucretius. This is the extension I trying to make from Lucretius to Viveros de Castro. Viveros de Castro not create, but he uses the multi of multinaturalism, and I think that it's very useful to understand much more better the statement that Deleuze constructing in the nature of that he wants to read in Lucretius. This is the thing that I'm trying to focus. Something like that. It's something I at this point I'm trying to begin to make this.
Thank you.
Creo que hay más preguntas. I think we are on time and you have to leave, Kathrin. But I would like to ask you a lot of questions. I will ask them by mail. I don't know.
Lovely. I definitely would.
I would like to thank you for connecting and share your presentation with us today. And bueno, y damos final a esta mesa y nos encontramos de nuevo a las 2 de la tarde para la próxima mesa. Que bueno, les agradecemos a todos la presencia.
Thank you very, very much, and I'll see you tomorrow, yeah? Thank you. Have a good day. I'm sad not to be closer, but well.